If you walked into a dispensary today, there is a real good chance you would find Northern Lights sitting on the shelf. Most people just walk right past it because it is old, it is familiar, and it does not have some flashy candy name. But here is the thing nobody tells you about Northern Lights. That plain little strain might be the single most influential strain in the entire world. Because Northern Lights did not just become famous. It quietly built the DNA of half the weed you have ever smoked. This is the story of how a strain grown in a Seattle basement ended up shaping modern cannabis as we know it. So let's start at the beginning, or at least the beginning as best as anyone can piece it together. The story you'll read on just about every seed website goes like this. Sometime in the late 1970s, on an island near Seattle, Washington, a mysterious grower known only as the Indian planted a batch of Afghani seeds indoors. He grew out 11 plants, labeled them Northern Lights number 1 through 11, and out of all of them, number 1 and number 5 stood out as something special, completely caked in resin and pure indica. That's the legend. And the legend is at least partly wrong. A more detailed and honestly more believable version has come out in recent years, traced back to a Seattle grower known as Seattle Greg. According to Greg, the real foundation came from a man named Steve Murphy, who ran a Seattle hydroponics shop and wrote one of the most advanced indoor growing books of the entire 1970s. Around 1979, Murphy handed Greg 4 seeds of an Afghan plant he called Purest Indica. Those 4 seeds were supposedly the true genetic starting point for Northern Lights. No one really knows if that's true or not, but what we can say for sure is this. Northern Lights came out of a small circle of growers in and around Seattle. It was built on Afghani genetics, and it happened somewhere in the late 1970s to early 1980s. Everything past that is contested, so we're not going to pretend otherwise. Now, why Afghani? This part actually matters because it is the whole key to the story. Afghani landrace plants had been grown for generations in the mountains of Afghanistan, particularly around regions like Mazar-e-Sharif, to make hash. They came with a very specific set of traits. They were short, they were bushy, they were absolutely drenched in resin, and most importantly, they flowered fast, often in just 6 to 8 weeks. And that was a massive deal, because almost all the weed Americans were smoking back then came from equatorial places like Colombia, Mexico, and Thailand. Those plants gave amazing highs, but they grew tall, they took forever to finish, and they were a nightmare to grow indoors or anywhere cold. Afghani flipped all of that. Short, fast, sturdy, and frosty. That is the raw material Northern Lights was built from, and it is exactly why it turned into such a perfect indoor plant. But a great plant in a Seattle basement does not change the world on its own. For that, it needed to travel. And that brings us to the man who turned this whole thing into a global phenomenon, an Australian named Nevil Schoenmakers. Nevil was a genetics obsessive who was breeding birds by the age of 8. After a rough stretch in his youth, he ended up moving to the Netherlands. He noticed the same problem everyone else had. The tropical strains floating around Europe grew terribly in the cold, and they performed poorly under lights. So Nevil made a brilliant pivot. Instead of selling weed, he decided to sell seeds. In 1983, he founded the Seed Bank of Holland, and then he did something nobody had ever done before. He took out an ad in the back of High Times magazine, offering to mail cannabis seeds straight to growers in America. He was the first person ever to do something like that out in the open. High Times literally crowned him the king of cannabis, and by 1985, he had reportedly sold seeds to 15,000 American customers. But to really take over, Nevil needed elite genetics, and right around the mid-80s, all the pieces fell into place at once. Northern Lights made its way to him from the Pacific Northwest, And at the same time, a Californian breeder named David Watson, who everybody knows as Sam the Skunkman, showed up in Amsterdam reportedly with a box holding 250,000 seeds, including legends like Skunk Number 1 and Haze. Along with other legendary genetics like G13 that were circulating in the scene, Nevil now had all the genetic pillars of modern weed sitting in one place in the Dutch countryside. Northern Lights, Skunk, Haze, and more. People later called that collection the Amsterdam Gene Pool, and Nevil ran the whole operation out of an 18th century estate he nicknamed Cannabis Castle, with grow rooms built into the catacombs underneath the mansion. Back in Amsterdam, Nevil worked to stabilize the Northern Lights genetics and get them breeding true. Now this is where one of the big myths around the strain comes in. These days, you'll constantly see Northern Lights described as an Afghani and Thai cross, but the original, at least the number 1, was a pure or nearly pure Afghani indica. The Thai influence most likely came in later in the Netherlands, in certain lines and phenotypes. So when somebody tells you flat out that Northern Lights is an Afghani-Thai hybrid, the honest answer is this: the original was basically pure Afghani, and the Thai part is real, but it applies to later versions of it, not the foundational plant. But soon after Nevil got them breeding true, the High Times Cannabis Cup kicked off in 1988 in Amsterdam, and once it added proper categories, Nevil's Northern Lights genetics absolutely steamrolled everything. In 1989, Northern Lights number 1 won the Pure Indica Cup, and the seed bank swept all 4 categories that year. Then, in 1990, Northern Lights number 5 took the Pure Indica Cup. And in 1993, Northern Lights won the overall Cannabis Cup outright. In fact, it won so often and so easily in those early years that people actually started asking for it to be retired from the competition, just to give other strains a chance. That's how dominant it was. Northern Lights became the benchmark, the standard that every other indica got measured against. So with that said, what was it actually like, you might ask? Northern Lights is around 90% indica, with compact, stocky plants and dense buds so coated in frosty crystal that most people believe that it's glittering. And it had traits that made growers fall in love with it. It flowered fast, taking about 6 to 8 weeks to finish. It stayed short, resisted mold and pests, and yielded big for its size. On top of all that, it was famously easy to grow, and even total beginners were able to cultivate it. It had this earthy, sweet, and piney smell thanks to dominant terpenes like myrcene and beta-pinene, and the high was an absolute textbook sedating indica, deeply relaxing, warm, dreamy, and great for sleep. But it is worth saying that it was never a THC monster by today's standards. It usually only landed somewhere in the high teens to low 20s%, and its reputation was always about the quality of the experience, not some sky-high THC percentage. But here's the real reason we're doing a whole video on this strain. It isn't about what Northern Lights is like to smoke. It's about what it produced. Because Northern Lights, and especially that number 5 phenotype, became one of the most important parent plants in the entire history of cannabis. Its genetics were stable, it was loaded with resin, it flowered fast, and it grew easy, which made it the perfect building block for breeders. They used it over and over to add potency, resin, and speed to other plants. Cross it with skunk, and you get Shiva skunk. Cross it with other genetics, and you get hash plant. Cross that famous number 5 with haze, and you get the legendary Northern Lights number 5 by Haze, which took the heady, soaring haze high and finally made it growable indoors. That single cross went on to dominate the cup for years. Build on it a little more, and you get Super Silver Haze, which won the cup 3 years in a row in the late 90s. Northern Lights even sits in the family tree of Jack Herer, one of the most awarded strains ever made. The way Nevil's own Wikipedia page puts it, Northern Lights genetics are found in the pedigrees of nearly all of the best modern indica lines, and the impact went even further than the family tree. Northern Lights helped drag cannabis indoors for good, proving you could grow world-class weed in a controlled room, fast and reliably. It helped build the entire Dutch seed industry that became the genetic supplier for the whole planet and became a household name in the process. It's the kind of strain people had heard of even if they had never smoked it, the name that just meant the good stuff. It got name-dropped in rap songs, and almost 40 years later, it's still sitting on shelves, which is something almost no product of any kind can claim. But as for the people behind it, they did not have the same type of success you'd think they'd have after making such a legendary strain, because Nevil's openness eventually caught up with him. The DEA launched Operation Green Merchant and started to come after seed banks. In 1990, while visiting Australia for the birth of his son, Nevil was arrested on behalf of the US government, facing an indictment that could have put him away for life. He posted bail and slipped back to the safety of the Netherlands, and the charges eventually got dropped years later. Around 1991, he sold the seed bank and cannabis castle to Ben Dronkers, who folded it into Sensi Seeds, which is why the official Northern Lights is listed as a Sensi product. So, would you say it is fair to say Northern Lights built modern cannabis? In my opinion, yeah. But not single-handedly by itself, because it stood on the shoulders of Afghani farmers who had been perfecting those plants for centuries, and it was refined by a whole cast of growers and breeders along the way. If you are ever hunting for the one indica that set the standard for indoor growing, that crushed the early cups, and that planted its DNA into a massive chunk of everything we smoke today, Northern Lights is right at the top of that very short list. It is a strain whose story is half documented history and half campfire legend, and somehow, for a plant that came up out of the underground, that feels exactly right.